We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Rachel Cohen. She is a lawyer who technically is on the payroll for a couple more days, as my understanding, at Skadden Arps, which is one of the biggest law firms in the country. Just give it for folks who don't know that world. Tell us about that firm, how big it is, where it fits in sort of like the legal world.
Anyone who's not familiar with that world, I am a bit jealous and wish that we could all remain unfamiliar, but unfortunately no longer the case. Skadden is one of, like you said, the largest law firms actually in the world. So we have a presence there's offices in Asia, in Europe, and I believe our revenues were upwards of several $billion with a B last year. The partners have a profit per partner that is in the seven figures, and there's a lot of kind of prestige chasing in the legal industry broadly. To the extent people care about for their employers, Skadden is very much on that list. There have been a couple of books that I've read actually where they were aimed at kind of legal audiences, and the way that they shorthand characterized a bit character as someone who was well-connected, but also maybe a little bit of I don't know if I can say douchebag on your show because I haven't watched it that much, was that they would say that they worked at Skadden Arps. So I'll be toning for that for some time.
That's good context.
How many, when we say the biggest law firm in the world, tell people how many lawyers work there? How many partners are there?
It's not necessarily one of the biggest law firms in the world, but it is one of the most profitable. I would say it has like some of the widest reach. And so I believe our partnership is only about 1,000 people. I can look it up right now. But it has much more to do with the level of profits that people have and the level of access that you have. There's a reason that our executive partner, Jeremy London, was speaking with Donald Trump directly about kind of the attack on law firms that has been launched by the Trump administration over the last several weeks. These law firms, Skadden, Paul Weiss, if people are familiar, are these firms that have made major deals with the Trump administration, including promising millions of dollars worth of pro bono work to the Trump administration.
I want to get to that because that to me is the one that really sort of resonates here. But so it starts with Paul Weiss, and ostensibly this is about Donald Trump taking vengeance against these firms that have had in the past a lot of Democratic clients. They're sort of like loosely associated with Democratic politics.
And I think Paul Weiss's partner was involved in the Stormy Daniels prosecution, the hush money case that had, was.
And in all these firms, there is somebody who either worked maybe in the context of the Mueller investigation or in other investigations against Donald Trump. So ostensibly, it's about revenge. Give me your sense of, well, before we get to that, tell us what it is exactly. When they went to Paul Weiss, when they went to Skadden Arps, and we should say there are other firms that have done something very different, and we'll get to those in a moment. But what is it? How does a government? How does the federal government go and say we're going to attack or punish you? Like what are they threatening them with?
The government is targeting a variety of corporate law firms, and there's firms that are fighting back. There's firms that aren't, as you mentioned, targeting a variety of corporate law firms by threatening to cancel government contracts or also use the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC's enforcement mechanisms to not only remove government contracts and security clearances from firms that they claim are engaging in quote unquote illegal DEI. My For 2 more days, boss used that term in an email sent firm-wide, which imagine being an attorney of color working 60, 70-hour weeks, constantly doing outstanding work and getting an email from your boss about how they wanted to listen to the Trump administration to stamp out the illegal DEI that is happening at Skadden Arps.
Imagine just being a lawyer and reading the words illegal DEI and saying, wait a second, a lawyer's writing this to
Jeremy, spell it out. It's diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And accessibility, actually, we should say, at least in the government context. But I mean, so what can they materially do? They can cancel government contracts that cost them money directly as a first order thing. They can also, I read, inhibit their ability to go into federal buildings, which I don't know how you can't obviously like go to federal court
Right.
and litigate in that instance.
And I do think, even to your point of like what they can do, I think that that's still very much being figured out. And that's why people are challenging these, because there's a lot of people, he's using these EEOC enforcement mechanisms through a certain extent. And my firm actually hadn't even been targeted by an executive order. They just received an EEOC demand letter, which, for the record, the deal they cut with Trump does not even include them dropping the EEOC demand letter or potential investigation. But they're using this kind of EEOC mechanism that a lot of former EEOC commissioners are saying is just patently illegal. They're using it wrong. And so even what they quote unquote can do, I think, is up for debate. But what they are doing.
We're talking about what they're threatening with, because we really don't know what they can do yet until it's resolved in a court of law. And you can't know what they can do until you stand up to them. And your soon-to-be former firm refused to do that. So, and we should say that it also sounds like, because I'm reading this story about Coy, I guess it is. Is that the name of the
Coy?
Parker's Coy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us their story, because this is sort of like the alternate universe. They decide, and frankly, the idea of a bunch of lawyers capitulating so quickly runs contrary to everything that I know of lawyers.
It's also a very bad deal. Even if you say these people aren't litigators, they're corporate, whatever. They went to the White House, didn't even have an executive order lodged against them, didn't get the EEOC demand letter, which requested personal information of my firm and also 19 other firms that was targeted at intimidating diverse employees, asking for name and email address and phone number and all of this stuff. They didn't even get that dropped, and they promised $100 million worth of pro bono hours to the Trump administration, which is more than twice Paul Weiss's $40 million that they promised that was a terrible deal anyway. But to jump back, and I have all of my little executive orders printed here, because this is such an esoteric and inaccessible part of the legal industry, which is already inaccessible deliberately for many people. And so even leading with kind of the way that these firms are being targeted, the executive order that was lodged against Perkins Coie. Before I came on, I heard y'all talking about these deportations and kind of the Stephen Miller of it all. And I think that it's important to name that the attacks on these corporate law firms, who are not very sympathetic victims, and I do not argue with anyone that they are, the attacks here are to intimidate corporate law firms out of providing certain forms of representation. Right. And they do a lot of asylum representation. They do a lot of kind of impact litigation because they're very well resourced. And so the Perkins Coie executive order was launched explicitly naming that it was meant to be retribution, because Perkins Coie had an attorney that used to work there named Mark Elias, who has since left and started his own firm that Trump really, really hates. And so we have this. But my friends and I started organizing in that moment because we read it, and it was clear in the executive order that the Trump administration was going to come after additional firms. And also in a public service loan forgiveness executive order, which came out the next day, he listed all of these different things that he didn't think should qualify for public service loan forgiveness anymore. And it includes things like aiding and abetting violations of federal immigration laws. And we know what that means in Trump speak. It includes things like supporting terrorism. We know what that means in Trump speak. Child abuse, including the chemical and surgical castration or mutilation of children, or the trafficking of children to so-called transgender sanctuary states. He's outlining what kind of work he does not want attorneys to be doing. And he followed it up, I believe, weekend before last, March 21st, it posted on the 22nd, with directions to the Attorney General to sanction attorneys that are engaged in this kind of representation.
And they can go back 8 years to assess whether these attorneys have been filing frivolous actions against the government simply based upon whether they lost. Yep. And so, of course.
If Trump was to apply that standard to himself, I'm not necessarily sure he would be able to do so with the level of frivolity. I mean, but his frivolous lawsuits were getting rewarded with this anticipatory obedience by what? It was the other media organizations that gave in, but the law firms too.
Yep,
So,
and it is anticipatory, and it's also all projection, right? But I'm sorry, Sam, please.
well, no. But I mean, I think the point you're making here is that this is all, any reason why they went after these firms was a pretense to basically say, you do not bring cases against us for immigration or any of our policy objectives that we want. And if you do, because Perkins Coie, they lost one or two clients. Apparently other clients were like, we appreciate what you're doing. But that's what this is about, right? I mean, it's about these law firms worrying that they're going to lose access, worrying that they're going to make targets out of their clients. Right? Like, I mean, if Skadden Arps is like representing, I don't know, pick a client, the federal government could be coming after these clients just because of their association with Skadden Arps. I mean, that's the fear here.
It is the fear, but it's also so ridiculous because it seems like all of these very smart people should understand. And I did work with them, and I do think that they're very smart, no matter how determined they are to prove me wrong over the last couple of days. But we have all of these very smart people, and surely you have to understand that you are not going to win by giving into a bully like the Trump administration. And I think it's this kind of like historical condescension where we're convinced that we can sit around and say, well, Neville Chamberlain, what a fool, when he was just giving into the German demands. But do we think it was more obvious at that time? Or do we think that we just, for some reason, believe that we're smarter than all of these people that are not that much older than us, are still human beings that are smarter than us? It's not as clear as people think it is. And people are acting like it's still 2016. They're determined to prove that they're smarter than Donald Trump is. And whether that's true or not, right now, it doesn't appear to be, because you are getting outplayed.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I mean, I think it's very scary. I think, once they come for the lawyers, once they basically say to the lawyers, you can't represent a certain various groups in our society, and the lawyers say, okay, then it's just the floodgates are open. Because right now, as it stands, there's, I mentioned this yesterday on the program, there's about 2 or 3 things that are basically slowing the roll of the Trump administration. One is any type of political pressure, and we see that with the elections that are taking place today, because that undermines the confidence maybe of some lawmakers, but there's only so much that's going to do. And the other is organizing amongst people, broadly speaking, labor, whatnot. But at this very moment, the one thing that is slowing the roll is like the 80 some odd, maybe now 90 cases that have been brought against the Trump administration in various forms that are slowing their roll. Now, here's the other thing about you brought up the pro bono stuff. The Trump administration now, like I say, is dealing with all of these lawsuits, whether they're from the ACLU, whether they're from the Brennan Center, whether they're from Perkins Coie, all across the board. They don't have the resources to deal with all of these cases that are coming in. The DOJ, if anything, they have less resources than they had 6 months ago, because they're firing all these prosecutors. They're firing all these DOJ people. They're installing political appointees. Not always the brightest bulbs, frankly.
Not at all. And I don't think that you can be a good attorney and work for the Trump administration, because it requires you to kind of bend and disregard the law in so many different ways, and the system itself in so many different ways, that even if you are smart, you're probably not a very good attorney if you're working for that administration in this moment.
I think that's absolutely the case. We saw that just with the federal prosecutors in the Southern District who had to resign because they're just like, none of this makes sense. Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.